on Server SAN. Where's everybody coming from? Maybe Stu, you could hit them up in the crowd chat. Ask people where they're chatting from. We're going to talk about Server SAN, which is a concept that Wikibon put forth about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and it was sort of in response to this trend towards scale-out architectures and low-cost commodity components and software-defined and all the other buzzwords. And we started to think about the next generation of server and storage infrastructure. And I guess I'd sort of make some initial comments that we've been observing for decades the function moving out of the host into the SAN for good reason. Offload the host, share data, better data availability. And what's happened is we've, in the last 4 or 5 years, started to see with the advent of flash and multi-core and lower cost memories and microprocessor power, function shifting back, moving closer to the SAN. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and Dave, if I can add to that, if you don't mind, just, it's funny, there's so many big trends that kind of play into this. When I first joined you at Wikibon a little over 5 years ago, David Floyer had been spending a lot of time talking to companies like, Apple and Yahoo and how they were building their architectures, and even in my previous job, I had talked to Google about how they were building their environment, and the way they think about storage and the way they build storage is very different from the way that we've done it in the enterprise for the last 15 to 20 years. So, we kind of see this mashup of, the wave, as you said, of the pendulum swinging back to the server. Flash, of course, is having a huge impact on all this, and kind of the extension of what converged infrastructure has been doing to really simplify the environment. So all of those things coming together kind of crystallized in what we call Server SAN. Most of the market call kind of that first instantiation of it hyperconverged, but what we've tried to lay out here is much more than just kind of the appliances of today. But what David Floyer is talking about is some of the high-performance pieces, what he calls flash as memory extension, and some of the evolution that we expect to see over the next few years as this revolution occurs.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And when we mentioned when we first started Wikibon, David, you'll remember we did a peer insight on Google storage, and we were looking at, this is way back in 2007, and we were just looking at the impact of these types of architectures bleeding into the enterprise, and it took a while, but it's finally starting to happen. So let me ask the first question. What's the premise behind Server SAN? Why is it relevant?
Should I have a go at that?
Please, David, go ahead and start.
Okay, so the current way of SANs essentially is a couple of two up to 8 processes which run a very proprietary set of software. They're very good at doing that software. Their original intent was to help take a very, very unfriendly piece of technology, which is the disk drive, and make those work for enterprise applications. And they were very, very successful in doing that. So that's the starting point. What were the good things about that? What made it happen? You could share data. The performance by putting big caches on the front end was okay. It worked well for that environment. And what it gave you was something in the order of 5 millisecond response times for I/O, which was fine. It worked well. As we move forward from that, we are getting much lower latencies, both capable, and what we have to do is look at what the architecture should be and could be in key environments. And the two key environments are capacity at one end and low latency at the other. So for low latency, you want the processor much closer to the storage, and the new storage for low latency is obviously flash. For capacity, you want to be able to use as much capacity as possible, and you want to be able to combine that with the server side and make that the lowest total cost possible. Both of those bring the storage closer to the processor. And if you bring it closer to the processor, you now have an environment where you can use standard operating systems, run the server, the storage underneath it, and you have a much larger total market looking very similar. So from a point of view of cost, the previous environment on SAN, where the SAN vendor pretty well dictated the cost of the software and the hardware and could charge high premium, 60, 70% premium, those are going away, and it'll be down into a much lower premium on equipment which is at the server level. So you're looking at having the sort of 30%. That's a halving in price, essentially, of the technologies. So that's the fundamental technology change and a consequent market change, which is in our opinion, will drive work away from the SAN back towards the processor. It'll be much lower cost. It'll be much higher latency for those works that need latency. It'll be much lower cost for the capacity sort of work. And then you've got the middle piece of that, and that's going to go over maybe a little bit later, but that's going to go over in exactly the same way because it's a lower cost environment. So it's cost and latency that are driving this move to server SAN.
Stu, anything you'd add to that, maybe from a networking perspective or a storage networking perspective? I mean, we saw in the early days of SAN the ascendancy of companies like Brocade, and of course, data was in there. What about that piece of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dave, because absolutely, Dave, the line you've quoted many times is the best I/O is no I/O. So if we can pull things into the environment, what Floyer's talked about an awful lot is the latency of these environments. So at the Flash Memory Summit, things I keep hearing a lot of is, PCI Express and extending that, in architectures that are really going to lower that latency. So I want to, pull the compute and the storage closer together, but that doesn't eliminate the need for the networks, but it's a little bit of a change in the way we do it. So, the reason we created Fiber Channel was primarily so that the storage team could control that network that goes along with storage. And I think we're going to see those boundaries breaking down, because what we need is access to the data, and the network just needs to kind of be there as opposed to having a separate network. So Ethernet's going to work for some of these environments. Most of the hyperconverged solutions that are out there today just connect via some kind of Ethernet protocol, and some of them are just going to be the rack level architectures, which are tying together the compute nodes. What David Floyer's talked often about is kind of the HPC type environments scaling out, as opposed to looking at things more from the storage networking that we've seen for the last 15 years or so.
So what type of workloads and applications are driving this need for server SAN in your view?
So at the two ends is where they're driving them at the moment. So for low latency applications, you're seeing PCIe very strongly coming through at the moment. I think that was one of the major trends at the Flash memory convention. So that's absolutely true. And what is happening is that the protocols are changing. If you're talking to people like Mellanox and Broadcom, they're in the vanguard of reducing the complexity and the overheads of these protocols, the SCSI protocols, for example. Those need to be brought down because they're a bottleneck. The latency with it between the compute and the storage is the bottleneck. You're seeing a lot of work in that area. Fundamentally, it's getting close. They're getting down to the microsecond level, even dipping down into the nanosecond. So that's 1,000 times faster than it is today with the millisecond levels that we could get to with the current architecture. That's going to be a huge increase in throughput through applications, the availability of much more data for applications, That's a very strong driver for this high-level, high-performance area. So I see pretty well all of that sort of work going straight onto server SAN. And at the other end, you've got the low-cost stuff, not only in large amounts, but in small amounts. So if you take the Internet of Things, where you need distributed, low-cost storage, then that is an area which is going to become server SAN, because it's just going to be the lowest cost. And in the mega data centers, exactly in the same way, you're seeing the hyperscale being the architecture of choice, putting whatever it is architecture you need there, HDDs or flash, close together, very low cost architectures where you're balancing storage and servers together. So those are the two workloads that, in my opinion, are driving it, the high end and the low end.
So a couple comments here. So Steve Kaplan, aka at ROI Dude, says all virtualized workloads, which is really interesting to me. So I'm saying, Steve, even traditional workloads. I'd love your comment on that. And then Gabriel Chapman said, I don't see any specific workload driving adoption. What you do see is specific use cases and vehicles being the driver. So am I to infer from those two comments that it's across the board and it's specific use cases? Do you sort of understand the questions and comments and agree with that? And what are those use cases?
Well, I think the use cases and applications, there's a strong correlation between those two. So the use case is for applications which want to drive low latencies. For
like what? Like what?
Well, let's take a current application which is take an example of a insurance company that's trying to drive out fraud. So if you take that example, at the moment, because of the limitation of the number of IOs that they can do, they can only check between 5 and 10%, score them. That's all the bandwidth there is. That's all the IO that there is to do.
You're talking about a risk assessment.
A risk assessment, yes. Is this fraud or not? Or should I be taking this business or not? Whatever the risk assessment is. Those are complex algorithms. They need a lot of data. Now, if I want to put that into real time, in other words, to do it or near real time so that I'm doing it as the data is coming in, I've got to have a capability of driving a huge amount more data, which means I need much lower latencies, I need much higher bandwidth. The only way you could do that is by bringing everything together much closer to it. So server SAN is going to be the ideal environment for that type of workload. That's one particular example of a use case or applications which require more data and are growing in that way. Now, those are going to grow over time. They're growing quite fast at the moment, those types of applications. And equally, the capacity ones are growing as well. So server SAN is moving in at the top and the bottom to take over from the traditional SAN environments.
So a couple other comments. Steve Kaplan says, earlier this year we had a Fortune 200 company start out with a 7-figure PO for Oracle and SAP on Nutanix. Now they're expanding to less mission-critical workloads. Somebody reports 7 figures is not that big. I'll take that. And Rich Holmes is saying it's very similar to adoption in server virtualization in the early days. But I think that's interesting. So let's explore that. Early days of server virtualization adoption were largely, I mean, people generally agree it was largely to deal with the underutilization problem. Yeah. And in fact, if you think about the early SAN days around the time of 2000, that was one of the challenges that SAN promised to deal with, was better utilization. And not sure it ever solved that problem. What it did solve is it allowed certainly better data availability, certainly offload the host. So I guess my question is how big is this space? Is this a hyperscale niche? Is it going into niches in traditional businesses, or is this essentially over time going to replace the SAN as we know it?
Well, in my opinion, it's going to replace the SAN. The SAN requires a network. It requires data to be quite a long way away. That doesn't mean that all data needs to be close by. Capacity data is going to be further away. So capacity data, though, wants the lowest cost possible. So that's the reason why at the low end, capacity is going to become hyperscale. I mean, that's the right solution for that large amount of data, and a lot of that is going to go into a cloud of one sort, whether it be a private cloud or whether it be a public cloud. A lot of data is going to go into that cloud structure for capacity. For the active data, and that's of course much more valuable, and the larger portion of the capacity is the larger portion of the terabytes, and active data, low latency data, is a higher proportion of the spend. That again is driving towards centralization, being much closer to the original processor itself. So you've got hyperscale on the capacity end, and you've got server SAN, if you like, the true server SAN, or both of them are server SAN, but the enterprise server SAN for the applications themselves also being on that. And the SAN piece is, there are some areas like that. The NAS area will continue for a long time. There are some benefits of having that in a distributed type of environment. But the traditional high-value SANs, such as the tier 1 SANs, those, in my opinion, will go down steadily, like everything else. They're good technologies, but they'll go down steadily over the next 10 years.
So, Stu, we've done some forecasts on this space. You just popped it in there. What is this showing?
Yeah, so what we've done, and we should probably talk a little bit about the updates we've seen in the last year or so, but there's two parts of the market, and they kind of go together. So at the beginning of this, we talked about what's happening in the cloud environments, what we usually refer to as the hyperscale environments, and then we have what's going on in the enterprise. And the part of the premise is that architecturally there's similarities between those two, and that the traditional enterprise is going to get squeezed out over the next 10 years or so by those two environments. So our public cloud forecast that we put out recently said that within the next 10 years, about a third of enterprise data center spend will go to the public cloud. But that still means there'll be plenty left on-prem, and a lot of what's left on-prem is going to go to more of this hyperconverged server SAN type environment. So that's, if you look at the graphic there, the red is the traditional SAN NAS type component in there. The blue is the newer environments, which have grown to hundreds of millions and now over $1 billion if you include what we call the system drag. And I'll let David explain that a little bit. And then the green on the top is what's happening in the cloud environment, which is growing at an amazing pace also. So that's where the forecasts are. It's still really early days, as we've said. You've got companies like Nutanix, in the lead from a revenue standpoint. The big players, the one that really got everybody to pay attention to the space is VMware with their vSAN or virtual SAN architecture. Partnering with a lot of companies, has a couple thousand customers at this point. Not as much revenue, but really got the market awareness of everybody as software is starting to eat away on the traditional storage base. So maybe at this point, David, it makes sense to talk about over the last year or so what we've seen and why we made an adjustment to talk about the software components a little bit more of this category.
Sure. What we're looking at with server SAN is software being the most important component, and that software is being run in commodity data centers or commodity servers on premise or within a cloud. So software is the most important component. like everything else, to begin with, that's often packaged with the storage, with the storage and the servers. So people like Nutanix are providing those as packages at the moment. But players like ServerSAN are obviously just distributing the software itself and allowing others to put together packages around it or taking it themselves. Now, so in terms of
sorry, David, sorry to interrupt you. You said players like ServerSAN?
Players like, I said vSAN, I meant, sorry about that.
So VMware.
VMware, yes, vSAN. Apologies for that. So if you take vSAN, for example, to compare that in the same marketplace with Nutanix, which is shipping a lot of servers and storage, is obviously not a correct comparison. So what we've done is introduce the concept of drag, which is the amount of equipment that software is dragging into the marketplace. So you've got however many nodes there are or however many installations there are, what is the drag of server and storage that's with it? And in that way, then we can compare Nutanix with vSAN plus the drag from vSAN, or Scality and the drag from Scality. So that then becomes a proper way of comparing the two marketplaces. If we compare that with the SAN, that obviously was a software plus a hardware drag. There's a software involved and hardware in the SAN as well. So it makes it a much cleaner comparison, and we can see what the trends are much more easily. So that was one of our changes to the forecast. The other change to the forecast was that it grew much faster than we predicted a year ago. Very significant increase in the adoption of it. So that again changed our longer-term view of where it was going.
So a couple interesting comments from the crowd here. Keith Townsend's pointing out that a lot of times for many projects, particularly in large, like for instance SAP installations, and others have commented on this as well, is storage is like a rounding error. Now my comment is it's still a $50 billion market. It's 10% of a trillion-dollar space, and so there will be share shifts involved. And so you've seen, a company like EMC has been able to command now granted it's more than just storage, but whatever, $40 billion plus market valuation, much of which of course is VMware, we know, but nonetheless it's a large market. But what about that? I mean, does that sort of underscore the lack of attention to infrastructure? Does infrastructure still matter? Is it just converging and going to be invisible? What are your thoughts on that?
Thoughts on that? Yeah, I mean, the key thing to me about SAP is that the ERP marketplace is well entrenched in data centers and organizations, but where is SAP going in the future? And if you look at what SAP can do, if it's provided with more data, if you can, for example, do real-time analytics and feed that back into the SAP system, the potential for benefit there is just enormous. It is if you can make the SAP application make the decisions that previously were done by people, your impact on productivity is 20, 30, 40, 50% potential over the next 10 years. So in answering the question, it's a rounding error, I disagree. The potential of the server SAN to deliver huge amounts of extra data, 1,000 times more data, is going to profoundly change the way that SAP can deliver value to the organization. Good SAP companies, ERP I meant by that, good ERP companies are going to take advantage of that and really prosper. And that's just true for ERP. It's true for a lot of other applications as well.
So, and historically, what do people want to buy in storage? They want to buy capacity, and they want to buy performance, and they want to buy resiliency.
Yeah.
Right. So, But the question then becomes, okay, if I can dramatically lower the cost of storage, am I going to shift that spend elsewhere, or am I just going to buy more storage? What do you see?
Oh, it's an elastic marketplace. It always has been. So if you reduce the cost, you're going to buy more storage. If you can get much lower latencies and improve the applications, you're going to buy more low latency storage at a higher price. I believe that currently storage is constrained in how much can get out there by the fact that most of it is on hard disk and very, very difficult to get to that data, very expensive to get to that data. If you lower the cost of access to that data and you lower the cost of processing the I/O, etc., and take away the overheads, it's an elastic market. You're going to sell a lot more storage. And that's what's shown in our detailed forecast of capacity versus when we look at the low latency marketplace and the capacity marketplaces. The capacity one, we believe, is going to grow very, very significantly over the next 10 years.
Well, so let's just review that again. So this doesn't happen overnight, but you're starting to show. If I go back to that chart that Stu posted, the one with the blue and the red and the green sort of areas, you show server stands starting to hit the steep part of the S-curve, I guess around 2018, really starting to eat into the traditional NAS and SAN space, and you know, in that time frame. And then essentially you're saying by the end of this decade, it's pretty much a server SAN and a hyperscale world. Is that right? Did I read that correctly?
That's correct from a volume point of view. From a revenue point of view, absolutely. Yes, we see as the technologies get better, as they mature over that time, as they're adopted by service providers and initially by the higher end of the higher or lower end of the enterprise marketplace. That's what we see as happening over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, Stu, I got a question for you. Gartner, I know, recently published a Magic Quadrant. It's kind of fun sport to be critical of those things, but you were critical of this last Magic Quadrant. Why?
Yeah. So first of all, it's I think what Gartner admitted is we're in a transition, and I guess the main critique I've had of these traditional tools that they use is they create these buckets with a kind of narrow definition, and they try to shove stuff into it, as opposed to our methodology is a little bit more to create an umbrella and give a vision as to where things are going. So you've got, what was traditionally the converged infrastructure, so things like the Oracle Exa blocks and datas, and the IBM Pure App in one category. You've got things like VCE and FlexPod in another, and then you've got the new stuff, all the hyperconverged players like Nutanix, Amplivity, Nimbox, etc. And they try to put them all in there. So I'm not going to talk about the dots because we can always argue how that is, but when they give the narrative, which is what I try to help give to the end user community, I feel it misses a major piece, that we have a major shift going on here, and the software is critically important. The whole definition by putting things in this box is that you must have a stack that's built and hardened and shipped. And while I think it's very important that you have full integration and you've done things like testing, and like what vBlock does is important. It takes that value stack, it puts it all together, I understand what I'm getting. And hyperconverged players, when I put an appliance together, I can do that too. But the real value is that shift in software. Going from what really was that enterprise mindset, which is I make a box and I put all the features in that box, and I want to lock down that configuration, and I don't want to change it, to more of the distributed architecture. So something like hyperconverged it should be the software where the value is. It's a pool. I have a platform. I should have extensibility to be able to add other features into it, and therefore, Gartner kind of just glosses over that whole piece of it, ignores most of what VMware's done with vSAN and gotten everybody excited about a lot of these, and kind of said, like, if you don't have a box or haven't put together a box, I can't, I can't consider you in this category, and just some of the details in there I felt were a little bit, it didn't add as much as I usually come to expect from the research from an article like this. There's just, to give an example of it, that SimpliVity was listed in there as spending too much time focused on VDI, and I've talked to quite a few SimpliVity customers, and unlike Nutanix, who started out in VDI and has branched out beyond that into a lot of environments, SimpliVity didn't start with VDI. They actually started with a lot of different applications and don't have a ton of VDI customers. So it just made me say, okay, if I got some of these basic facts wrong, how valuable is the rest of the pieces put in that article?
So a couple comments. I mean, I think you're saying they're trying to stuff too much into the quadrant, and it's sort of mixing the bag and not really helping people sort of parse through what's really happening. But I said I don't envy the Gartners and the IDCs of the world during these big transitions, because you can never get it perfectly right. Rich Holmes is saying it's really hard to measure hyperconverged because people are building their own stuff, so rolling their own and lumping them onto industry standard servers. And Keith Townsend made the point, Stu. I wonder if you could comment. If the application buying center is driving infrastructure purchase, then the Magic Quadrant makes a little bit more sense. Why is that, Keith and Stu? Does that make sense to you?
So, I'm not quite sure what he's trying to say there, Dave, because if the application owner's buying it, the infrastructure matters a little bit less, and I just need to make sure that I'm buying from a reputable player with a good product in there. Therefore, I should be able to go to the leader category, is I'm guessing what he's saying. Yeah. I mean, Keith's made some public statements about that he finds some value or can understand why the C-suite uses this tool, and I'm not trying to say that there isn't value there. Just from the infrastructure standpoint, I didn't feel it did a good job of really differentiating what is the difference between the players here, what is the vision of where they're trying to go, and as you said, it kind of munged together. Some solutions that have been around for a few years, very stable, have billions of dollars of revenue, and a new technology that's relatively immature, in a much smaller revenue place from a lot more startups.
Okay, so he commented they view things, I presume he means the application heads, view things in the box perspective. And I'm thinking that what he means is that if the box lessens my storage labor problem, it's goodness, and I'll buy the one that does that the best. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was another comment in the crowd chat there. That we want infrastructure to become more normalized. It should become more standardized, and that's what I want from an application standpoint. Is I want to know that things like my performance, my uptime, and my capacity are there when I need, not create a temple for my database that's bespoke to that infrastructure. So that's just the trend in general. Is we want to make it more flexible, more extensible, and that's what really the server-side hyperconverged type environments are promising. So the application head going forward shouldn't have to think about their infrastructure. Somebody should put that platform in place, and it should work for a lot of environments I have, which today really is not the case that we have.
So Steve Kaplan says, to put a comment, that hyperconverged is so first half 2015, which I love the comment, and so we're kind of moving on. But from David, you had a comment, and then I want to shift to the practitioner's perspective.
Sure. Obviously, over time, everything is moving towards the cloud, whether it be a private cloud, a public cloud, or a hybrid cloud. And the key issue of a cloud is that it's automated and that the two key aspects of that are, well, the key aspect of it is automation of that and provisioning, auto-provisioning of that, and allowing the users themselves to buy it by the drink and charge out for it by the drink. That change means that the application people are going to find it much simpler to purchase capacity. They're not ever going to have to think about boxes again. So they want something that's simple and easy to use with the applications, and that's what the infrastructure people are doing at the moment. So I don't see applications really being that much involved, except from the point of view of what is the latency, how much can I get for that price? At low latency, what can I get from a capacity point of view? How can I use that to provide value in my applications to the end users?
So I'm going to post the next question, but before we go there, and I want to sort of come back to earth a little bit into the data center and try to take the practitioner's view. But before I do, Stu just posted a chart on the vendors here. So if I expand that, take us through this, Stu. Who are the leaders here? I can't really read this that well.
Yeah, sorry about that. You know, the top revenue leader is Nutanix. So they're the ones that have been out there the most, have customers, you know, driving revenue. Our expectation, based on what we've seen and, you know, public comments from the executive team there, is that they'll IPO this year. A surprise to many in number 2 is HP. Those of us that have tracked this industry for a while remember the Left Hand acquisition, which was originally for iSCSI, turned into one of the earliest VSAs on the marketplace, and HP has continued to mature that product, and it is the store virtuals, their hyperconverged offering that they have. Number 3 on the list is VMware, which you're taking not only the licenses from VMware, but all of the drag that they put together for things like the vSAN ready nodes. Evo was not a significant amount of revenue in 2014, but that falls into that bucket. And of course, VMware is trying to partner with lots of server and storage manufacturers. And then there's a bevy of other companies. My commentary on this, Dave, has been storage has always been super competitive, and it's not like anybody's taking 50% of this market today. Nutanix being the largest, and you're seeing companies like IBM, we expect to push in this space, even though they really don't have a direct play in it today. HP will expand what they're doing. EMC, along with VCE and the VX rack, are going to push hard in this space. So just because we know where the horses are on the track today, I expect things to change greatly over the next kind of 18 months.
So I'm going to come back to this, the practitioner view. Keith Townsend was picking up on some of the stuff that Floyer said, or at least seconding it. Said same concept of cloud. Application owners want turnkey solutions. If they buy one of these platforms, then they buy base infrastructure. Or they bypass, I think he means, the infrastructure group. Give me what I need to run my app, damn the rest of the general infrastructure. I couldn't agree more. It's really the application heads have the juice within organizations. Now, infrastructure guys can sometimes muddy the waters and give you reasons why it won't work, and that can screw things up. But if the application head can get what he or she wants, they generally will win. So let's bring it back to the data center. If I'm an infrastructure head and an application head, so you got that dynamic. Application guy cares about speed to value and application functionality, and really doesn't care about the infrastructure, just make it work. But the infrastructure guys have to worry about that, obviously, and sometimes have veto power. So you've got an aging application infrastructure. The average age of an application is close to 2 decades old. You got all these assets on the books. You got storage, networking, and servers, all bespoke on the books. Yeah, you're playing around with converged infrastructure, and maybe you're playing around with so-called hyperconverged, but the vast majority of your infrastructure is traditional. So I'm at point A. How do I get to point B without ripping and replacing all this gear and without my CFO firing, getting me fired? So, David, maybe you can have at that.
Sure, I think that's an absolutely crucial question. You can't rip and replace everything. The cost of conversion is just so high. We know that from our earlier days, how expensive that is and how threatening it can be to the survival of an organization. So it has to evolve in a good way. So what you're looking at is, first of all, moving towards a cloud structure with the infrastructure. So it has to deliver to the application head in a way that they can take it and use it. And they have to deliver low latency, and they have to deliver capacity. Obviously, the infrastructure people have a broader remit too, and they're important in this discussion because they have to make sure that it's compliant across the organization, that data flows across the organization, and is of value across different user departments. So a user can't just go and say, I want this application and damn the rest. There is a healthy balance between IT looking at the enterprise as a whole values and the end user department. But from the application head, if the first stage is making a cloud out of it, and he can do that easily and buy it by the drink, then that's the first stage to me. And that's going to be why then behind the scenes, the infrastructure people are going to provide that data, sometimes from mega data centers, sometimes from private clouds, sometimes from public clouds. That then becomes a second level decision about the best way to provide that capacity or that latency. In general, the capacity stuff is going to be in more of it in the clouds earlier on, and the latency is going to be on-premise, more in private clouds. Those private clouds themselves may well be in mega data centers. So it's going to be a patchwork approach which best suits that particular enterprise in that particular vertical.
Oh. Anything anyone would add to that before I want to move on to another question? But yeah, that's not an easy problem, and it's not something that's going to happen. It's going to happen, which can. But Stu, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think David covered that well. I guess, David, one of the critiques we've been getting is people look at where we are today, and two things. One is, what if I want to scale my compute and my storage separately? And secondly, this is a real small piece of the market today. It seems kind of like a niche architecture. Why is this going to just kind of sweep the floor over the next 10 years? I mean, my initial response is, you just look at Moore's law, where we're going in the architectures, and it's pulling back. But maybe you can give a little bit of color to that.
Taking the second piece first, if you have a situation where you can provide a better product, and that's the option of very much lower latency, a better product which is much lower cost capacity, and it's half the price, you're going to have a very, very significant force moving to that way of doing it. The cloud uses server-sand today. That seems to be, that's growing very rapidly indeed. That's one of the major pulls on this sort of technology, and the enterprise is going to follow because of those pressures on the whole marketplace. What was the first part of the question, Stu? Can you just repeat that?
Yes. So David, that's how, if I'm putting my compute and my storage together, don't I want to be able to scale them independently? And especially, David, maybe you can talk, there's the all-flash array part of the market and this, and they seem to compete against each other long term.
Right, and obviously the array marketplace is going all-flash, but as you get towards flash, so the network becomes the bottleneck. So you want in low latency environments, you have to pull that back towards the server. It has to be much shorter distances. It will be much shorter distances. That's happening very, very fast indeed at the high end. So for that part of the marketplace, yes, you want to scale servers and storage separately, but you can do that. All of them pretty well support some sort of hypervisor type of mechanism, and you can share the servers and storage very effectively across a much larger number of servers. So that's happening in hyperscale. That will happen in general, in my opinion.
Are you saying so? Yeah. So you hear that a lot. That you hear that notion of I can't scale. A lot of the hyperscale solutions, I can't scale storage independent of server. There seems the guys who are accused of that seem to have a response. Are you saying that issue is overblown because of virtualization, or?
I think it's overblown because the way that it's brought to market at the moment in players like Nutanix is in fairly rigid boxes. That'll change over time. That reflects a particular way of doing it at the moment, and that's obviously when you're wanting to have converged infrastructure solutions, you do have some sort of constraints there. But that's a growing pain, in my opinion, and they will allow much more flexibility of how the server is used versus the storage. It'll be natural. It'll just be done as part of the normal scheduling process within a cluster. That's not rocket science, and that's where it's going.
So, several interesting comments. So Keith Townsend says, I don't really care about scaling independently, at least in my space. I have tons of wasted compute and storage, and it's just mice nuts is my words, not his.
Yeah.
And then some others have sort of chimed in on that as well. But then Julian Wood points out, yeah, but if I'm a really small organization, being able to add disks independently can be very, very important because I don't have the budgets of these big guys. And I think that's I think they're sort of both fair comments.
I agree, especially at the low end. You want this low. If you're looking at the Internet of Things and putting some storage near a windmill or something like that, you want very low cost server, and you want the server to be doing everything, and you want to be able to add storage as you need it and add capacity to the server as you need it. I couldn't agree more that it's got to be independent, and vSAN is in that particular area a very good solution.
By the way, for people listening in, try to make your comments inside the thread so that we can, when somebody comes back to read the crowd chat, they can see the questions and answers together. That would be really helpful. So my next question is, what's the relationship, and I think Brian Gracely's on, I thought I saw him in here earlier, it would be great if he could weigh in on this. What's the relationship between DevOps and server SAN, and what are the organizational considerations that warrant attention in that regard? What about that? I mean, is DevOps sort of changing the relationship between infrastructure and application folks? Is server SAN a part of that, and how do I organize for success?
Is Brian taking that, or do you want me to have a go? Or?
Yeah, I don't know if he's on the Hangout, but yeah.
Brian's not definitely not on the video. I think he was on some of the crowd chat. He might be listening. But,
yeah, so take a stab at that. Maybe he can chime in. Go ahead, David.
Okay, so DevOps is a really strong way of reducing the cost. In other words, you're taking the different ways that you manage things at the moment, and you're managing in silos. There's a storage silo, there's a server silo, there's a network silo, and then they get together to sort out how things work together. The whole process is moving development and ops closer together, and effectively taking away all of those three silos and making it much simpler. And that's what is happening in the hyperconverged space. It's happening in the converged infrastructure space. All of those are attempting to make the application of server or the availability of server and the availability of storage and network really transparent to the developers. that's the cloud infrastructure that's providing that service. I would argue that moving towards server SAN is going to actually help the movement towards DevOps. Getting the movement towards clouds, private clouds and public clouds, is going to help the movement to DevOps. Taking away the complexity of the storage infrastructure by going more to flash is moving stuff towards DevOps. So all of those are components which is making the adoption of DevOps much simpler to do, or much easier to do, and make it much more relevant. So it's, in my view, it's the advent of clouds, the advent of Flash, the advent of server SAN will make DevOps the organization of choice over time.
So Keith Townsend has there's several comments here that I want to unpack. Keith's saying, depends on what direction of DevOps you're coming from, developer-driven or infrastructure-driven. I don't believe it's commonly a joint or equal movement within organizations. I think this is very true, right? I mean,
absolutely.
A lot of organizations, you could call it ops dev as opposed to DevOps.
Yep.
And so that there's, when you ask people, talk to CIOs, oh yeah, we're doing DevOps, but when you unpack it and really try to understand, what's going on, a lot of times it's just sort of grassroots. A lot of times it is ops dev, and of course in a lot of organizations it is application, head driven. So several good comments there. Rich Holmes says programmers are spending the majority of their time statistically developing. For the rest, that means a solution that supports REST API is going to be critical for easy development.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's see. Julian Wood says problem is hyperconverged infrastructure is still expensive today, so DevOps being preferred in public cloud with simpler API than internally managed. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, over the last year, we've seen, all the storage players, talking a little bit more about how they're going to be developer friendly, and I think we have a ways to go in this space, kind of for the hyperconverged space. Do I have an API? Can I, develop to that platform? I think that I haven't seen the DevOps movement really move into this space all that strongly yet. I saw a couple of comments. Nutanix says they've seen some good uses with what they're trying to do with Acropolis, which is their own stack that they've built, very much leveraged off open source components. So as things like OpenStack and other open source components start building into the environments, there should be good opportunities to fit into the whole DevOps movement.
Well, it's interesting. Acropolis is the sort of intercloud capability that Nutanix announced at .next, and I commented in the crowd chat that when we were down there, Stu, we heard, dozens of practitioners. I asked them, why are you interested in this? And the #1 response I got was, because I want to reduce my reliance on VMware. And Steve Kaplan saying he hasn't seen that per se, but rather a desire for greater simplicity. But I found that to be an overwhelming sentiment among the users that I talked to at .next, is that their frustration with the VTAX and just their reliance on VMware. Love VMware, but trying to find ways to better leverage other hypervisors, Hyper-V, KVM, etc. Did you see that as well, Stu?
Yeah, definitely, Dave. And yeah, I guess not much more to add on that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Okay, so my next question is, what do you do if you're a storage admin and your expertise is LUN management? What do you do?
Start training.
Start training, yes. That's, there is always, of course, going to be a limited number of people who are needed to make sure the storage fits in and deal with deep issues and sort them out. There'll always be people, but there'll be very few indeed. So the number of deep, they have a choice. They can be a deep expert, or they can become more of a generalist and start to be able to look at the network and the server side of things, and start to be a person who is an infrastructure person as opposed to a storage person. Those are the two choices that they have.
Keith Townsend said, learn networking, SDN, because no one is converging networking. Furrier's looking for comments. He just landed at LinuxCon. They're doing the Cube up there in Seattle today. And is there a Linux play in all this, or is it sort of cross-platform?
Well, absolutely.
Like Linux is dominant, right?
Linux is dominant in the storage area, full stop. Linux is what's making it easy to move to hyperscale, because you can take the Linux functionality in the controllers, storage controllers, and move them into hyperscale, and that's what ESA has been doing, and a number of other storage vendors have been doing. Linux makes that migration to server SAN much, much simpler. Yes, Linux is the heart of storage.
So I'm going to go back to the earlier question. Rich Holmes had a comment. Just like platforms are converging, many organizations are looking to converge storage and server teams, for sure. Choosing a solution that can be managed using a centralized solution such as vCenter means that learning curve is much easier, and that's clearly something that VMware has been pushing. In a way, that's what Elliott Management has been pushing. Bring the storage and server teams together, and maybe under VMware, or not. Maybe they're pushing for the other direction. Let's see. Go ahead.
If VMware get it right and make it applicable to the application developers, the application development group, they have as good a shot as anybody as providing a value in this space. I think they've just got to bring down the prices and go for volume. That's a fundamental decision that they have to make. But they have great technology, and they've got great I/O. They're starting to have solve the problem with vSAN rather than relying on traditional storage arrays. They've lost a few years waiting for that. But if they can bring down the price and make it competitive and improve the functionality, they can have a real strong play in this space.
And I love the comments from Thomas Bryan and Gabriel Chapman. Gabriel Chapman says, I've been telling storage admins to learn something else for years, which is definitely not a popular thing to hear at storage conferences. But it's and then he mentions collapsing silos and being part of a cross-functional team will become the norm eventually. And then Thomas Bryan, I think, has a comment that really underscores some of the frustration that you sometimes see between application heads, DBAs, and the storage guys. Stop trying to be a silo would be a good start. Storage needs to be a consultative role. Work with the business versus being a black box. Now, part of the reason why the storage guys are black box is because it was like they got the SAN working. It was like, don't touch my friggin' SAN because it's working. But the reality is that times are changing, and there's a lot of tension between the application teams and DBAs and storage heads, and that, I think, is good advice.
Yeah, and Dave, if I can comment on that, one of the concerns we have is that we've made good progress for where hyperconverged is today, but what we don't want it to do is become yet another silo. So, if it can't become really the platform that I build for my infrastructure and, be scalable, extensible, easily manageable, it's just going to be something that fits for certain applications, and I'll have yet another silo in our environment. We'll see. We're going to be at VMworld in a couple of weeks here. We're going to be talking to see where they are with vSAN, where their customers are. It's really a good place for us to get the pulse of everything that's going on in this space. Not only VMware, but really everybody that partners and competes with them. We're going to have a lot of them on the Cube and digging in with them for a lot further detail as to what's going on in this space.
So one of the comment I want to get in here, Mark Farley mentions that while it's still off in the distance, Intel's new Optane memory could turn the whole HCI world on its ear in 3 to 4 years. Every server would be hyperconverged as the memory tech becomes mainstream. So that sounds like a topic for another crowd chat, which I'd love to focus on. Cool stuff. A lot of NDA stuff coming. Stu, last question is, how do we learn more about this topic? You got some research on it. Where do we find that? Maybe give you a little commercial here at the end.
Yeah, so great. Thanks, Dave, and thank you, David. So, our whole team, is writing. If you go to, it's wikibon.com. So, many of you know the Wikibon community, but if you haven't checked, this year we relaunched the website, beginning of the year, wikibon.com. It's cloud, big data and infrastructure. So obviously, kind of the server SAN hyperconvergence piece is primarily in the infrastructure piece. Hit that up. If you go to siliconangle.tv, you'll find all the events we're going to be at. All of us on the call here are going to be at VMworld, and of course, hit us up on Twitter. You know, feel free to share an email, and hit us up through social channels to find out more. We'll have lots more coming up in the from the research side as well as the video side.
Yeah, great. And I see somebody added 10 minutes to the crowd chat just in case anybody wants to poke around, vote, put in some other comments. But we're going to end at the top of the hour. We're going to end the Google Hangout. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming on. Thanks to Stu and David. Really great stuff. You guys have been on the forefront of this research for a while. Really appreciate what you're doing and sharing with the broader community. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.